So welcome everyone. You're welcome. To an exploration of youth incarceration in Hudson Valley with Alexandra Cox. We're very grateful to have her here today. This is a collaboration with the library, with Prison Public Memory Project, which most of you know because they began in Hudson with their important work with the Girls Reformatory and are continuing throughout the United States. And just on a personal note, I feel very proud to be in a community that values studying this subject and making a difference, because I'm not supposed to be political because we are the library, but what is going on in prison reform is essential to us being decent. So anyway, I just want to make a couple of announcements. The first one is that we have our annual fundraiser for the library. It's called Booked for an Evening in Wonderland, and it's going to be a festive evening of cocktails, dinners, and there's lots of surprises. It's at a beautiful private home in Hudson, August 11th, which is this coming Saturday. It begins at 6, it runs 6 to 10 p.m., and it will be, we promise it will be a wonderful evening. We have a lot of different local food businesses that are having stations throughout the outdoors, and lots of surprises for you. And our youth is involved, so that's always fun. There are a few tickets available if you would like to attend, and that's on our website. And there's also tickets for sale, raffle tickets for, it's called Season of Dining Out, and there's like a whole slew of local restaurants, including Back Bar, The Maker, Hudson Food Studio, Handmade, William Farmer, Local 111, and you get 2 meals at each restaurant throughout the year. You choose when you want to have your dinner, and the winner takes everything. It's $20 for a raffle ticket, so if you would like that. And then we also have a wonderful event that we have something to do with. It's run by the Friends of Odell Lake and the Friends of Hudson Youth, and it's the first annual Odell Lake Picnic. And this is also a really important event for youth because there are people now who are really trying to bring back the youth department, who are working on the physical infrastructure of Odell Lake and also the programming for youth. It is August 9th, which is this Thursday, 4 to 6. There's free hot dogs. And there's a historic exhibition on the history of Odell Lake, which is absolutely fascinating. Right, Jeff? And I hope that you all can make it, because I think this is going to be a great community project for us. So on to our event. Alexandra Cox is a lecturer at University of Essex in their Department of Sociology, and prior to receiving her PhD in criminology from the University of Cambridge, she worked at Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem as a sentencing mitigation specialist on their youth law team. She is a former Gates Cambridge Scholar and a Soros Justice Advocacy Fellow. She was the board chair of Drama Club, which conducts their theater workshops inside of juvenile facilities, and was on the board of the New York State Defenders Association and Reentry Columbia. Prior to working at the University of Essex, she was an assistant professor of sociology at the State University of New York at New Paltz and a research scholar in law at Yale Law School. She was also part of the Prison Voices Project radio collective, which produced a regular show on WGXC in Hudson, and taught a college course at Brookwood Secure Center. She is the author of Trapped in a Vice, The Consequences of Confinement for Young People, and we'll be selling that at the back if you're interested in that book, and she will be signing it for you. After she speaks, she will be joined in conversation with Frankie Y. Bailey, PhD she's a professor in the School of Criminal Justice, University of Albany, SUNY. She studies crime history and crime and mass media, popular culture, and material culture. She is the author of 5 mysteries featuring amateur sleuth Lizzie Stewart and 2 police procedural novels featuring Albany police detective Hannah Stewart. Frankie collaborates with the Prison Public Memory Project on scholarship about the birth and evolution of the House of Refuge for Women and the New York State Training School for Girls in Hudson, New York. Frankie is a professor in the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Albany. She serves as the director of the school's Justice and Multiculturalism in the 21st Century Project. So we're very proud to have both ladies with us, and we'll begin with Alexandra.
So thank you so much, Brenda, for organizing this event, and also to Emily. I'm really grateful to be here, and also to the Prison Public Memory Project, which has been so helpful to me in doing some of the archival work for this book, which I'm going to be talking about tonight. And also, I'm so pleased to see so many familiar faces here, so Quentin Cross and Russ Mergen and Allison McKim from Bard, and others who have really helped to really inform this conversation about this book. And so, you know, this book is really not the work of a single person, but of many. And I'm also really grateful to Dr. Bailey for being in conversation with me about the book after I talk a little bit about it. What I wanted to focus on today was the relevance of this book for the Hudson Valley and really for Hudson itself, because that's why we're here, and also Hudson is really what led me to write this book. About 10 years ago, I really first started doing research here, but this project really started a lot earlier than that. Back in 2004, I started working in New York City, and I was representing teenagers charged as adults under a law called, it was a statute called the Juvenile Offender Statute. And that statute was passed in 1978, and it allowed for 13 to 15-year-olds to be charged as adults and to face adult-level penalties in New York. And many of those young people were my clients. They were young people in New York City who were facing really lengthy penalties. And so many of those young people were being sent to Brookwood, which is right outside of Hudson. And it was funny because I spent so much time with my clients on Rikers Island or in many of the juvenile facilities in New York City, but I really had never spent any time in the places where I was really so strongly advocating for them, in many ways not to go, but where they ended up. And I left that job to go to graduate school, and I really became interested in how little had been written about young people's time inside of juvenile facilities, and sort of so few people who had gone inside and studied the texture of what happens inside of facilities. And Brookwood was what brought me back to New York. And in many ways, Willie Bosket, who was the young man who at the beginning of really set, in 1978, set off and initiated the kind of laws that were passed, which allowed so many of my clients to be sentenced to such lengthy terms in custody, was in many ways the reason why I came here. In 1978 was the year of my birth, and it was the year when Willie was 15 years old and was accused of killing 2 people on the New York City subways. And under the laws at the time, Willie would have only faced up to 5 years in a juvenile facility in the state of New York, and there was a public outcry about his case. And the New York State Legislature subsequently passed the laws which would really begin to shape the lives of so many young people in New York. So what I want to think about today is sort of how this person, this Willie Bosket, kind of, and his story, and in fact he passed through Brookwood Secure Center in 1974, began to kind of shape actually some of the stories which I'll talk about today, which are the ways that in some ways what we assume to be true about youth punishment, which is that it's ever and increasingly more soft or more therapeutic, actually has some sort of somewhat darker undertones, which I think are important to kind of understand. So what I'll talk about today are kind of 4 key claims. One is that I want to talk about why the Hudson Valley, and Hudson in particular, is a really important lens through which we can kind of understand juvenile justice and the history of juvenile imprisonment in New York State more broadly. Also, the fact that juvenile justice landscapes cannot be neatly characterized as either punitive or treatment focused, and that in many ways the history of juvenile justice teaches us that there's a complex relationship between care and control. that the interventions used with young people in facilities, in custody, have to be understood in terms of the broader context in which they are being sentenced and the kind of criminalization processes that are used and approaches used with them. And that also juvenile facilities themselves are often highly misunderstood, that so much of us know about these places or think about these places through, today it's Netflix or documentaries or public scrutiny, but we know so little about what happens inside. And these places are very complex, and for the many people who work inside of them, I think the facilities themselves are really often misunderstood, and I want to try to give a little bit more texture to what goes on inside of them. So thinking about Hudson Valley, Brookwood Secure Center is really a place, it's located, for those of you who are sort of unfamiliar with it, right outside of Hudson in Claverack. And it was originally a site served as an annex for the Hudson Training School for Girls, and was a facility for girls who were said to require more intense levels of treatment. And it's a facility now which houses young men charged as juvenile offenders, but also now girls again, because a few years ago girls were brought back to Brookwood, and girls charged as juvenile offenders themselves. And it's a place which brought me here, but also I think has become a really important place for me to think about the history of care and control. In the middle of the 19th century, Charles Loring Brace, who was a New York philanthropist and social reformer, he became concerned about the rising numbers of poor European immigrant children in New York City. He was disconcerted by city-based institutions aimed at the care of young people. Instead, he saw promise and potential in rural facility life. He felt that the outcasts, vicious, reckless multitudes of New York's boys swarming in every foul alley and low street could only be reformed in the homes of good rural families. So you'll see the child savers kind of recovering the young children from New York City streets and bringing them to the pastures, rural pastures where they could be cured and reformed. And Charles Loring Brace founded the orphan train movement, which was a movement to bring young children out to the kind of rural heartland. But it was Charles Loring Brace's philosophy of care about rural life that interested me at first, in part because when I first began doing this work, of course, so many of the facilities where young people are sent are in rural areas across New York State, and yet so many of the children that I've been initially serving were from New York City. And at the time that I began my work, really it was 60% of young people in care who were sent from New York City to these rural facilities. I became really intrigued by the kind of guiding philosophy of sentimental pastoralism, which was really this idea that the removal and care of children in rural life would have restorative properties in their kind of beings and their characters. But I also began to think about the ways that it was important to be critical about this history and to interrogate it, because it was built on the assumption that a child's home environment and also their family set their criminality into motion. And it was oriented around the idea that that criminality could be cured or restored through rural life. But it never allowed us, in many ways, to turn the lens away from the lawbreakers, from the children, towards the lawmakers themselves. In what ways did or do those lawmakers kind of contribute also to that process of criminalization that led those children away from places like New York City? Who was criminalized? In many ways, that question has been increasingly important, as we know that the early facilities were built only for white children. And the children who were deemed to be reformable were only white children. And as we shift, and I'll talk a little bit more about what the facilities look like today, how do we think about that question differently? So as the juvenile reform movement set into motion, what really a lot of the reformers began to think about was that young people, the sense was that young people should not be housed in facilities with adults. They should be separated from adults and could only be reformed in facilities separate from adults, which in part led to the establishment of the reformatory and training school movement. So with the beautiful work of Prison Public Memory Project, we've really unearthed so much information about the Hudson Girls Training School and places like it, where this idea that young people could be removed from their homes and placed in environments where they could be essentially reformed became a kind of dominant philosophy of the late 19th and early 20th century. And the New York State Training School for Girls opened in June 1904 at the site of the former House of Refuge for Women. This training school is today going to become essentially a youth prison, or has become a prison for young people who are impacted by a recent change in the law to raise the age of criminal responsibility. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means for our thinking about the history of this system of justice. I also spent time at the State Industrial School, which is located just outside of Rochester, and this site was built in the early 20th century as well, and is now called Industry, which is a facility for young people, again, charged as juvenile offenders or adults. One of the words that I talk about and I use in my book, which every person has read has said they've had to look up because they don't understand it, is the word palimpsest. A palimpsest is something that is reused or altered, but still bears visible traces of its earlier form. Again, a palimpsest is something that is reused or altered, but still bears visible traces of its earlier form. I thought about a palimpsest as I walked through the grounds of what is now called Industry to do my research, and these buildings are in many cases still intact. Now, a lot of people would say that we've moved past the days of the training schools and the reform schools, and we sort of moved to a more enlightened form of care. But I would like to think critically about the ways that this history and the residue of the past remains in the way that we think about young people and the way we treat young people. Although reform and the process of reform has long been part of the DNA of juvenile justice in America, we've been in a perpetual state of reform in many ways. The first really arguably significant wave of reforms happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. And actually New York was really a big site of reform in many ways. So actually Abraham Novick, who I was just talking to Dr. Bailey about, who was the superintendent of our Hudson, New York State Training School for Girls in 1963, said that commitment to or placement in an institution should be looked upon as a last resort. He began to publish, this was in a white paper that he published, and he was widely published in journals around the country. He was active in the social work movement. He was part of the National Association of Training Schools and Juvenile Agencies. He said, last resort is not to be defined as a process of identifying the impossible child for shipment to Siberia, but the considered decision of responsible people that a relatively controlled environment is required for rehabilitation and eventual adjustment. Throughout the 60s and 70s, the New York Times was filled with headlines about the horrors of training schools and reformatories. There was a large-scale reform movement aimed at trying to close these facilities and open up facilities in the community. And in many ways, it worked. So there was a massive, large-scale deinstitutionalization process. Many, many young people were shifted from care to the community during the 1970s. And much of the kind of consistent message was that these facilities were, in many ways, criminogenic, crime-causing, that young people would be safer in their home communities and environments. And as you can see, the director and superintendent of the state training school himself argued this. And then, in 1978, came Willie Bosket. And this law that was passed in 1978, which allowed for the criminalization of 13, 14, and 15-year-olds as adults, really, in many ways, arguably shifted the kind of tenor of juvenile justice in New York State. Now, I think one misconception in New York State is that we for many years have been kind of an outlier in that 16-year-olds in New York State were automatically charged as adults. And that changed in 2017, and I'll talk about why. But that law has been in place actually since the early 20th century. And so in many ways, New York State has always been quite punitive towards young people charged as adults, and actually quite punitive towards black children. So in many ways, there was a shift when Willie Bosket was arrested and when the law changed, and the population of young people in facilities went up. But there was also an attendant rise in youth crime rates as well in the 1990s, and a rising number of youth in facilities overall. And we always allowed for 16-year-olds and older, they were to be automatically charged as adults, and they would always go to youth prisons. I entered the facilities in what I think is kind of what I would call the kind of newer wave of reforms that happened. These reforms started happening around 2007, when Elliot Spitzer appointed Gladys Carrion, who's up here on the top left-hand side, to be the commissioner of the state system. And Gladys Carrion was, she formerly worked, I think, at the United Way in New York City, and she was brought in as a kind of reformer, a child-friendly, a person who was going to change the system. Here she's touring an empty Tryon. Tryon was a facility that closed after a young person, well, it closed for a variety of reasons, but a young person died after being restrained by staff in that facility and died of asphyxiation. And the facility became emblematic of some of the kind of horrors of abuse in the system, and it closed, yet remained open because of a kind of a little known provision in the union law which allowed the facility to stay open for a year after close. So this tour was a big kind of torch demonstrating the excesses of confinement and punishment. Cuomo also went to Green Correctional Facility, which is where, as I said, 16 and 17-year-olds can be sent to adult state prison in New York, and he became ostensibly interested in the conditions of confinement for teenagers. And in his State of the State address in 2011, he said, in response to a lot of critiques or supposed resistance by staff and facilities against the closure of the facilities, I understand the importance of keeping jobs, especially in upstate New York. I also understand that does not justify the burden on the taxpayer and the violation of civil rights of the young person who's in a program they don't need, where they're not being treated hundreds of miles from their home to save state jobs. An incarceration program is not an employment program. And Cuomo, in concert with New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, worked together to create a project called Close to Home, which resulted in large-scale deinstitutionalization of the system once again. And the state ultimately closed down 31 facilities and reduced its admissions numbers from approximately 1,600 young people in 2007 to just 338 young people in 2016. And then came 2017. And you'll see this is it's consistent with a kind of overall decline of youth confinement across the country. And I think that's really important to note. You know, New York was not alone in kind of really engaging in a conversation about the need for juvenile correctional reform. And I think New York is an important case study, but really reflective of a lot of national trends. So in 2017, the New York State Legislature passed a bill to raise the age of criminal responsibility. Now, they only did it in a narrow way. They did it automatically for young people charged with misdemeanors, and then they created some carve-outs for young people charged with felonies. But for the most part, the bill allowed for the most part, for young people still to be charged as adults. And so, where are we? In many ways, we're in an interesting moment because we're sort of back again. Hudson Training School is now Hudson Correctional Facility, and it's a facility which is going to take in young people and serve them, but under the auspices of the Department of Corrections. Brookwood will take on a number of young people who they might receive under this new law. And in many ways, we're kind of in a place again where we were a number of years ago. And I think it's important to think about what care looks like in that context. And I think that what I want to kind of just spend the brief remaining time talking about are sort of some of the key points from what I learned from going inside. So I gained access to New York State's juvenile facilities to do this research. I did in-depth qualitative research inside of the facilities in a number of facilities, approximately six residential facilities across New York State. And I did my research between 2008 and 2011, sort of in the real prime context of the reforms. And I also then went back and did research with staff in the facilities. So I did two separate projects, one working with young people and then one working with staff. And I also did a set of observational research and research in the community, but I want to focus today, really, my remarks on the experiences I had in the facility. So the first point that I want to make is about the very interventions that happen inside of facilities with young people. So what one assumes is that when young people are sent away from home and they're sent into these custodial environments, the main effort that's aimed at them is sort of a kind of rehabilitative effort at change. And what I began to observe in the facilities was, in many ways, a kind of riff on what was old, and in many ways what was old was new. So in the facilities at the time that I was in them, and I want to note that this has changed somewhat, but still remains somewhat intact, young people had to advance through a behavioral change system that was denoted by the color of their shoelaces. So when they arrived in a facility, they were given a set of shoes and a set of white shoelaces. It was interesting during a prison public memory project talk, actually, I learned that at the Hudson Girls Training Facility, the color of a girl's hair ribbon symbolized her stage of change, roughly. The behavioral change system in New York State emphasizes self-mastery and discipline, deference, responsibility, and self-control as the markers of success. So young people are encouraged to take their treatment into their own hands and to engage in a program of self-control and change. They're expected to engage in a process of willful self-change. So as they advance through the stages of change, and these are roughly mapped onto the shoelaces that existed, they're expected to sort of perform, in many ways, change as they move up through the system. And that performance of change involves deference, control, keeping one's hands behind one's back, saying yes, sir, no, sir. And they're encouraged to engage in that change on their own and to take responsibility for their actions. And this system, which a lot of young people refer to as the program, serves as the overarching scaffolding of facility life. Now, my friends who work in the facility will also be quick to point out that the facility life actually does involve a far more complex negotiation of change, of legitimation of power, and of management of change. But this, what I want to point out is the kind of scaffolding for change that exists, that is set by the kind of central administration and exists in various ways. If you go to New York City, they use also a similar process of moving up through a process of change stage system. But what I found was very interesting is that in addition to this scaffolding of change, throughout the reforms, there were all of these kinds of new, so-called new innovations and new treatment therapies and programs that were introduced into the system. And at the time I was there was a new trauma-informed process of change and treatment program that was initiated. But yet, that program of treatment really, it's important to understand, kind of either overlay what already existed or sort of only was able to kind of creep in bits and pieces. And in fact, I was struck when I went into a staff office. I was in an office of a staff member who was a staff youth counselor. And there was a pile of books in the corner of his office. This was the book. And they were kind of in the corner pile of his office. And I said, why is that book in the corner? And he said, well, that's what we were using 2 weeks ago. They told us to throw it out. We're on to the next, And we sort of joked about it because I flipped through the book and I noticed that a lot of the kinds of example activities and the expectations that were in this moral reclamation therapy workbook could actually be mapped on quite well to what was being introduced in the facility at the time I was there. And what the staff member said to me is sort of like, same shit, different day, kind of, but I think what struck me was that I was in a facility where, in many ways, like the kind of processes of change that the state was introducing, which were said to be innovative or treatment-oriented, were in many ways viewed by staff with some cynicism, in part because the system was constantly in a process of change, and in many ways fell back on this kind of this token economy seemed to be the kind of one consistent approach to change that seems to kind of exist over the course of the history of the system. And I think that this led me to the symbol of the vice, which is really the focus of this book. The vice is really, it pushes as much as it pulls. What I found while I was inside is that this is a system which, on its face, is aimed at promoting change in the lives of young people. And it relies upon these kinds of tools and strategies, this idea of behavioral change, that if young people can only engage in a certain kind of behavioral change, that they will ostensibly be liberated from the oppressive power of delinquency. But yet, the system, I think, really enmeshes them in ways that they struggle to move beyond. And many of the staff recognize this, actually. It was the staff, in fact, who taught me about the ways that this vice existed. Because what they knew and to be true, and what the young people ultimately knew to be true, was that they faced substantial barriers to the realization of that change on the outside. So, a number of young people, especially those charged as adults, faced enormous barriers to obtain housing, to obtain lifelong supports through employment, education. Many of them were in foster care and aging out of foster care and unable to find a home when they got home. They faced enormously low expectations of change. They faced deep and persistent questions about staying free of incarceration and police custody when they got home. And I say that quite deliberately. How can they stay free of incarceration and police custody? Not how can they stay free of crime. Because these were young people from heavily policed neighborhoods. They were from places where they, one young person who I talked to in my book had been stopped by the police 15 times in 1 month. They had deep and serious questions about how they could gain access not only to college and further education, but also to a career, not just a job. Questions about finding love and friendship, support and certainty. And those barriers were so deep and so persistent in ways that this process of behavioral change so powerfully failed to meet. At the time that I was doing my own research, the state released their research about the system, finding that stunningly 71% of boys who exited residential care from New York State were reincarcerated by the time they were 28 years old. That's 71% of boys. Now the state could use this as a marker for change and for changing their interventions. They use this data as a way to say, well, we're really interested in finding ways to end delinquency. What I became really interested in were some of the ways that we can think about ending criminalization. What we also began to see as the reforms happened were deeper and deeper racial disproportionalities happening in the system. So as the system shrunk, the racial disproportionality rose, and I think that's something that is really critical to think about as we begin to think about reforming the system. And I think that finally, what I began to think about were not only the ways that these kind of external realities for young people function, but also the ways that these internal realities of the organization really impacted on young people's lives. So many of our understandings of juvenile facilities come from the public media. The facilities are either, they're seen as places of brutality. Young people get beat up, the staff are horrible, they're white racist rednecks, they're all of these terrible things. But actually, when I entered the facilities, there were complex ways in which control and custody manifested themselves. So yes, I may have seen young people being required to walk in a straight line with their hands behind their back. And in fact, this policy changed while I was in New York State. And staff resisted that policy change. But in many ways, the staff had these very difficult ways of grappling with young people's emotional lives in the facilities. They saw that young people formed friendships, and often very deep friendships, in the kinds of margins of the facilities. Often the times that I saw the most beautiful kind of friendships arise were in the downtime of facility life, when they were playing cards or moving around. And in many ways, staff sought out the only form of control that they could level against young people, which is the way that they felt that they could, which was one little, effort to get young people to hold hands behind their back. Young people, and often also the image that we have of staff is that they're only overwhelmingly brutal. They're only overwhelmingly focused on beating young people up. But that also is not entirely accurate. Staff had a number of very important relationships with young people, and in fact, it was staff who taught me that there were huge barriers for young people upon their release from facilities, and it was staff who taught me about the failures of the facilities to meet those needs of young people. It wasn't the state itself. And in fact, the state's failures to do that really became quite visible to me through the comments by the staff. And also, these staff are not all white, racist rednecks. In fact, 51% of the staff in New York's juvenile facilities are African American. And this is increasingly true of prisons and jails across America, as the jobs that exist in this kind of post-industrial life are corrections and law enforcement jobs. And they become very viable forms of employment in the wake of the changing nature of work. And staff don't all rely upon brutality in their relationships. Some form very long-lasting relationships with kids despite those prohibitions. And I think that what I want us to think about a little bit are some of the ways that care and control and custody and control sometimes exist and coexist in uncomfortable ways in these facilities. And they raise persistent questions for us as we seek out reforms where we think that perhaps the intervention aimed at making a facility more therapeutic is the answer. And I want to kind of end with the suggestion that actually we move towards thinking about what some have called non-reformist reforms, which are reforms that are conceived not in terms of what is possible within the framework of the giving system. So I go back to the palimpsest, revising those kinds of thinking about what we can do forever and ever literally on the land of Hudson Girls Training School, but also in view of what should be made possible in terms of human needs and demands. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, first let me congratulate you on a book that's incredibly readable and also an important contribution to the literature on juvenile justice through that whole discussion. So I have a whole list of questions here. I'm only going to ask about 2 or 3 at most of these, depending on how quickly you respond. And then I'm going to open it up and let you all ask questions because I'm sure you have lots of things you want to get into here. I'm just going to pull out the ones that I found particularly interesting in terms of my list here. So if you could talk a bit more about that concept of badness. It's one of the key themes in your book, the notion of badness, and how it applies outside and inside the facilities, particularly in terms of race and gender, how that plays out.
Yes, so Frankie's talking about, there's a part of my book where I talk about young people who, just to back up, the concept first came to me when I first started interviewing a lot of my clients, and I would, part of my process of talking to young people, I would sort of ask them to tell me a little bit about themselves, and so that we could learn more for the case and do an effective, present an effective defense. And a lot of my clients would say to me, well, I was a bad kid. And it was my mentor at the time who said to me, well, actually, that's an adult word, that's not a kid's word. And I think I began to think more critically about how young people's ideas about being bad were actually system-identified ideas about being bad. So on Rikers Island, where a lot of my clients were located, I told a story about one young person who went to Rikers and who began to experience himself as a bad kid and see himself engage in what he called kind of badness and get enmeshed in this system of badness and lose hope and become despairing and kind of lose sight of his vision for change. And I think that I also began to see the ways that badness also was rewarded in the system. So the system's expectations of this group of young people, this largely criminalized group of young people of color, and also actually in girls who affected in particular, began to in many ways view badness as the kind of default expectation of behavior, and in a kind of pernicious way, sort of create and force young people to kind of inhabit an identity of badness. And I think I distinguish that. So criminology classes we teach about what's called labeling theory, and sort of roughly speaking, we talk about processes of like stigma and the ways that people become labeled and then begin to kind of internalize those labels. And I think I see this as different from kind of straightforward labeling in that young people inhabit these modes of badness and in some ways get, they don't necessarily, want to inhabit this kind of position of badness, but there are ways that they can kind of move through the system and get, one young person called it juice.
Yeah, I was really fascinated about the performance in front of the video cameras as
right.
a way of acquiring that. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, like a couple of young people talked about their time in the facility so there are video cameras all around the facilities, and they talked about being bad in front of video cameras in part to get more attention from staff. And it's funny, I now have a teenage girl in my life who's my partner's daughter, and I realize, I also think about this differently now too, that there are these also unconscious ways that young people seek out attention through, that then, because they're not being paid attention to in many ways, because they're being neglected and discarded, and that kind of video cameras. Or in another facility, this was a private residential facility, one of the kids I talked to said he got juice from staff by being bad. So it was almost as if, the staff could only see the young person if they were bad, if that makes sense, so they only became visible to them if they were bad. And girls face that particularly badly. I talk about one young woman who I met who was seen as incredibly obstreperous, violent, difficult in one of the facilities, and she was placed on all these behavior protocols. She was placed on a protocol called egregious behavior protocol, which is
love that phrase.
And eventually, and what was powerful about her is that she, in her own time with me, talked about how completely idiotic the system was and had a really interesting critique of it, and didn't want to participate in this kind of program of change. And for that, she was punished very badly, and in fact, eventually she was arrested. She was 16 when she turned 16 in the facility. She was arrested and sent to the local county jail, which was in a rural county jail, and shipped out of the facility. So she gained when I first entered the facility, everyone was talking about her, they were quite obsessed with her. She gained quite a lot of attention, but it also was punitive attention as well.
So, following up on that, I'm really interested in the re-entry issue because it's so important for adults. And what you argued in the book is that the children, the young people can work the program, they can learn self-management, they can do the things required of them, but they're not necessarily acquiring the skills, either personal or in terms of the labor market, I'm assuming, that would prepare them to go out and be successful in terms of re-entry. Could you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I was in a facility, and I remember I knew well that, because I'd spent a lot of time in the facilities, but I also was teaching in the facilities, that the state was spending an enormous amount of energy trying to introduce all kinds of trauma therapies and programs, but they were doing next to nothing to facilitate a young person's process home. So even though they had a mantra about re-entry and they talked the talk, there was zero process of change. So in fact, I even struggled a lot with the state because there's a basic system in New York City, that I know from working in New York City, that allows people to get housing. And it's a form that needs to be filled out. And if you're a teenager, if you've been in foster care, if you're homeless, when you get released, there are a number of criteria that you can meet to get housing. And a lot of the young people in facilities met that criteria. Now, the sensible thing, the practical thing seemed to be to get the staff to fill that form out before kids left. Because it's a pretty simple form to fill out. And I talked to the state about doing it and over time completely resisted doing it. And I was so curious as to why, because actually one time I was in a facility and there was a kid in one of the units who was pacing back and forth in a room. And the staff were talking about him, and they said he was, I think, 16 or 17 at the time, and he was in foster care, and he had no home to go to upon his release, and his release date was the next week, and he was incredibly anxious, understandably so. And the staff, who had smuggled their cell phones into the facility were frantically Googling housing options for teenagers. And they knew nothing about housing options for teenagers, but they were frantically trying to find something for this kid because the kid was completely freaking out. And their sense was like the state was doing nothing to help him get to where he was going. And I think, I think I was struck by the kind of inertia that there was the public message by the state that they were interested in the care of teenagers, but in fact were so willing to abandon them. In part because it seems like the message of trauma and treatment and everything was sort of, in some ways, seemed to override all of these other concerns. And I began to think about why. I mean, I think, in part, when I talked to the state, there was a sense that this was someone else's problem, in many ways. So, a sense like this is another agency's problem, or at the time, parole was taking those kids on, and still is, but the state developed a relationship with parole somewhat. But I think there was a sense like, look, this is what we can do now, and what's the point of trying to facilitate some of this action? But it was, a lot of staff felt deeply despairing about what was happening.
So they're calling between the gaps in agencies
who
should be responding to the reentry issue.
Yeah, and also, especially for the young people charged as adults, they really fall between the gaps because they're going on adult-level parole. And they're also, a lot of them actually, because of housing bans, a lot of them are going back to New York City housing where they were banned from living, but they were 18 years old, so they would be homeless, but still quite young, and, they fell into all of these kinds of there was a sense of that they had the responsibility because they were adults, they're on adult-level parole, and the parole would treat them as such. But still in many ways treated as kids.
One more tiny follow-up. Is there any type of programming that prepares them to go out as adults and do things like find an apartment or job skills training? How do you apply for a job? Or is that left to whatever they're going to find in terms of programming once they're released?
Well, okay, I should give a caveat. The last time I was in the facilities was when I finished teaching there, which would have been in 2015. So this is some of my knowledge. I mean, you can, if anyone in the audience, I know maybe some folks from Brookwood were going to come tonight, so perhaps can correct me if I'm wrong. But when I was there, the short answer is no. I mean, there were some vocational programs. At Brookwood, there was a horticulture class.
I found that really interesting.
Yes, and there were a few kinds of box-ticking exercises, I would say. And then the college program at Brookwood started introducing the College Initiative, which is a really great program in New York City, which helps to facilitate placement in college. So that was a good initiative. But straightforward, kind of efforts at life skills, sort of building efforts, at least not when I was there, no.
I think we got this started, so I will open it up to you all for follow-up questions.
I have a quick one. Is there other major industrial countries that you have studied closely that are worse than us? Or are we do you get where I'm going with this question? Are we the worst and then other countries have found more success?
Well,
let's just say Russia, China, England.
Yeah. So I should say as Brenda said, I live in England now. I've been living there for a year. I'm wary of comparisons only because I moved to England and I thought, I'm moving to Europe. It's the place that everyone sort of fantasizes about as being better than America. And in fact, the conditions of confinement in English juvenile prisons are horrific. And many of these places were built in the Victorian era and have been deemed not fit for purpose. And in many ways, some of the same behavioral change modalities have crossed the Atlantic. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy and sort of behavioral treatment interventions have become, and in England they're nationalized. So they're used all around the country. And so when I think worse, sometimes I guess maybe this was partly the point of my talk, is that sometimes we think worse is like beatings and brutality and solitary confinement. But I think it's important to be critical about what we look at. I mean, I think also, like I went to Ghana to look at their juvenile system, and what I was struck by was that I walked into one of the prisons and the juvenile facility, and I mean the conditions were poor in that they were very basic, like they, but what was interesting is that there were no fences or wires, and the person who ran it is a social worker, and all the people who run the institution are social workers, and he needed one of the kids in the facility to go and run an errand in the local town, and he gave him some money, and he ran the errand and came back. And I told this story to some of the young men at Brookwood who I taught, and they were shocked to learn that there could be this level of trust in a facility that, ostensibly locked people up. And I think what I was struck by in Ghana was the kind of person-centered approach, which was, like, in some ways the facility grounds didn't matter. So I didn't completely answer your question, but comparisons are interesting only in that we have to be vigilant about how we compare.
But it's a worldwide problem, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think in some ways, like, we should be scrutinizing other systems.
Yes, I don't think that the country can go state to state to find
Yes,
discrepancy.
right.
My question is, are you aware of the current development of for-profit
Yeah.
systems and development of them throughout the country? Where is that right now?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So actually in the 70s in New York, the New York State Commissioner, I think it was Peter Edelman, who was Marion Wright Edelman's husband, who used to run the New York State system. I think it was Peter Edelman who discovered that there was a loophole in the sort of federal funding processes, that if the state relied upon nonprofit agencies to incarcerate young people, or they wouldn't call it incarcerate, but put them in custody, that they could receive federal matching dollars. And so when Close to Home happened, which was that bill that I told you, or which passed, they exploited that federal funding. It was a funding gamut, because actually Cuomo and others could say, "Oh, this is great, we're bringing kids closer to home," but actually the kids were being placed into nonprofit agencies and receiving federal funding. The state didn't have to pay, the localities didn't have to pay as much. Now those are nonprofit agencies, but I think the reason why I give that example is that I think it's important to think about, I think about them as like charter schools almost. It's like they kind of run outside of the oversight of state systems in some ways, even though they're state funded and there's some state oversight, they're in a gray zone. I mean, there are a number of for-profit childhood residential care agencies all around the country, many for very wealthy children, right? So like, those are fascinating because those also in some ways need to be scrutinized because they involve a lot of behavioral change measures that are quite extreme. And there have been some really wonderful books written about these kinds of programs. Those are equally, I mean, that's a kind of whole industry actually of for-profit. And those are to be distinguished from for-profit prisons. But I do just want to say one thing about for-profit prisons, which is that they are actually state institutions. They're state funded, so they're private agencies that receive they bid out to states. So they're still state funded and should still face state scrutiny and regulation. Same for for-profit.
They can inspect it by the state and have to abide by the state policies and regulations that they...
So like New York doesn't have any for-profit prisons, but the states that do, they're state, and it's actually a really small percentage of prisons in this country, but so the state will send out a bid for contract to a for-profit agency, and then the for-profit agency will bid to incarcerate, essentially.
I just want to say thank you because I think the three of us have just come from Brookwood.
Oh yeah,
So,
I haven't.
I think you've articulated so much within such a brief amount of time, and I worked in corrections for several years, and I wanted to move on and work with kids. And in the 4 years that I've been at Brookwood, I've found that it's very frustrating for the reason that we've moved from one treatment modality to the other with this whole idea of the New York model.
Flavor of the month.
And
Sorry.
with the New York model, it is a token economy. And so for clinical staff, it's very difficult because we're not, we're teaching skills, but we're not encouraged to look at some of the other broader socio-political, cultural aspects of what's going on with each individual child. And so I think what happens is you just try to work within that system while you're making your numbers and still make an impact.
That's right, yeah. And you're all three of you are clinical staff? Yeah.
Psychologist, social worker.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I continued to go back inside and teach in Brookwood because I feel the same way. I mean, I'm committed to doing the work, and I think it's really important. And but I could see, part of the reason why I went back into facilities to talk to staff for so long was that when I first started doing research in the facilities, I felt like the story of reform could not be told without talking to staff in many ways, because it's so easy to denigrate and to sort of, and also to assume that reform is like just this single process, when in fact reform comes from Albany, right? And Albany makes policy decisions, and they devise these. At the time I was leaving, this New York model was being implemented, and but you know, people who work on the front lines are there every day, building relationships with young people and managing expectations and interacting. I mean, there are different kinds of staff in the facilities, all different levels of staff, and it's such a complex environment, and it's incredibly frustrating. So when I interviewed 70 staff, and the average tenure for the staff in the facilities was 18 years. Now that's, I think at the time that was 4 commissioners. Now every time a commissioner comes in, they come in with a big new program of reform, right? And those staff straddled that system of change. And in many ways, you know, you have to begin to imagine what that's like then for staff to kind of then be told one day to the next that they're doing a different kind of program, which often does sort of somewhat resemble the program from before. But it's a really complicated environment to work in also. And you know, at the time, Brookwood had a single mental health unit. I don't know if it still has.
Yeah.
But at the time I started doing research in the facilities, there was 1 psychiatrist for the entire system. And that's an enormous system. That's across the entire state. And even when I first started working at Brookwood, there was only 1 psychologist and like very few social workers. It's changed a lot. So it's a difficult environment.
If you had your way, how would you change the milieu of some of the facilities?
Well, that's a great question. I think there was a question behind you, and then maybe I can get to that. Is that okay? I'll answer another question first, and then.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question on the housing. As a practical matter, do the folks who are leaving this neck of the woods and going to New York City end up in a homeless shelter?
That's a really good question. Well, it depends on how old you are, right? So if
the ones that are adults.
The ones that are adults, yes. Because if you, if you're 18 and you don't have anywhere to go, then the stop number 1 would be a homeless shelter. But one thing actually I'll add is that, so if you're a teenager starting at age 13 and you're charged with a sex offense in New York State, you're subject to residency requirements, and New York State has a rule where people can't live within 1,000 feet of a school, and that's almost the entire island of Manhattan, and much of the Bronx and much of Brooklyn. So actually, a young person who was my client, who was incarcerated at Brookwood, was subject to those requirements, and he, the only place that would take him was a homeless shelter at Bellevue Men's Shelter. At the time, and I think Bellevue is not even accepting anybody in that status right now. For the most part, that's the only arrangement that can be. If that's the arrangement that's made, that's the arrangement that's made. They go to a homeless shelter. Yeah. And then should I answer your question or go to Quentin? Okay.
I just wanted to also thank you and to speak to like the complexities that you spoke of the staff, but also the folks who industry in a WACA 101 radio role. I'll never forget it.
Wow.
And I was in the first cohort of the Orientation, Transition, Adjustment, and Honors.
Where are you? Oh, the shoelaces.
Yeah, no, they had bands first.
Oh, right, I remember,
They
yeah.
had bands. And I was at a facility where I was in a WACA first, but Nasson Park in Buffalo had just closed. So all the black staff came and bumped, I'll never forget it, bumped many people out of their jobs or came in and took jobs and took leadership.
Wow.
So it was at a time that was
That's interesting,
very,
yeah.
it was difficult, an adjustment. When I think back on that time and the people who influenced my life, and then the 77 people who were on my unit at the time, there's something to be said about what models you use and how you interact, because those are surrogate parents.
Yeah.
What I want to impress upon this group, out of the 77 people who were there, I'll never forget them. I don't know, my mind has always worked those types of things. Only 2 of us had family engagement. Two people who had family involvement. 2 people who had, who knew where they were going afterwards, which led me to do a lot of the work that I do now. But it's something to be said about
Yeah, that's huge.
all those things.
And something you said was making me think, just one quick note, which is that, I don't know if this has changed, but at the time when I was working, the state had a prohibition on staff having contact with young people after they left.
Still there.
Yeah, and the prohibition was about like grooming. It was this idea that people might groom staff for inappropriate, children for inappropriate reasons, like sexual reasons. And when we talked to the state, it was interesting because a lot of the young people. There was a staff member in the facility, and sadly he's not here today, but he really, someone I've connected with a lot, and he was from Albany, and his nephew was incarcerated in the facility. And I read about him in the book, and he was, he was tough, and he wasn't for everybody, but a lot of young people formed a really strong bond with him, and he started a reading group in the facility and did a lot of good stuff. And it was interesting because he didn't necessarily want to stay in touch with people, but I think he was really invested in them. And a lot of the guys saw him as a father figure in some ways. And I think, it's a sad state when we have these kinds of, we shouldn't have to, the facilities shouldn't be used to solve these kinds of social problems or create substitutes for parenting. But I was struck when the state created that prohibition, because I think there's almost a way that so the state's response around family has been to say family is everything. But family is also complicated, right? For so many, I'm sure for some of the young people you work with, they haven't been in touch with their birth parents for many years, or they've aged out of foster care and they don't have, so family is super complicated. And it's not, obviously, a lot of people have family, an engaged family, and a family can't get up to the facilities because they're hours away. But I think that the state response has been this easy sort of family is important, family engagement program, but it's really complex, I think. And then I really started to talk to you. I'm going to give you the not great answer, which is something that I say at the end of the book, which is that in some ways we've rarely said do nothing, because we're so fixated on reform and changing and doing, always coming up with the best new intervention. And I suppose part of the reason why I was drawn to the Prison Public Memory Project was that I think history can teach us a lot. And I think that often when I work with reformers in New York City, I feel like I'm working in a vacuum. I feel like there's not a lot of attention to what's been done in the past. And I think that there's not a lot of attention to the kinds of broader consequences of what we as reformers do. So in some ways I want the lens to come back on us, and instead of on kids and our obsession with changing kids. Does Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Right.
see, I've had experience, I've done this. I'm retired, I'm 81 years old. I worked in the 70s and in the 80s in Manhattan, the Tombs and
Oh, did you?
And we were to change the current mental health system to a more team-oriented approach. And we went into the Tombs with, I had a team of case managers who we assigned to a variety of inmates from the Tombs up to Matterhorn, actually. And the idea was to bring the concept of team approach and bring the health, the professionals, the social workers, psychologists, and like in Willowbrook, teachers.
Treatment team.
Yeah. With the milieu that has a therapeutic community perspective of some kind, and that in some way would create a sense of safety, confidence, and good health about the environment you live in. That seems to all have gone away now. So
I think the folks at Brookwood can correct me, but when I was there, they used the term treatment team meeting.
yes,
I don't think it's what you're talking about. So there's a meet, so the YDA, who's the youth development aide, is the sort of what uniform staff, counselor, and if there's a social worker involved, we'll meet to talk about the young person. But in terms of the vision model for milieu therapy and like what you're referring to, I don't think it functions in the way that he's talking about in terms of the treatment team.
well, these were adults, they weren't young people. Okay, these were young adults in the Tombs, the adults that were there.
But I think it's
The treatment team model was the model. Yeah.
And I think they kind of roughly took that model and tried to say, we're doing this, but I'm not sure it's done in the spirit of what you're talking about, which is essentially creating a milieu for a young person to kind of grow and develop and think about them as a whole person. I saw it more as a box-ticking exercise, so like when I was there, there are a lot of forms that are filled in about young people, whether they're complying with a behavior management plan, and I mean, I think they probably, like, it was nice because they were, sometimes they were really nice conversations about how a young person was doing, but I don't know, the folks from Brookwood, I don't know if you still have the treatment team meetings.
We still have treatment team meetings. We have the strangest way to describe it is each pod has two wings. There's central office, there's core office in the middle and two wings. And each wing is made up of different staff, and each staff is like a different family, and each family has different ways with dealing with their kids, and it's all based around one thing. We're trying the best we can in the system we have to help the kids learn what they can to get out, stay out, and be straight up. And it's hard on our staff, our line staff. It's hard on the kids. And it's an ongoing, ever-changing situation. And let's add a new flavor. A lot of the kids we have come from across borders. They've got families that they're not sure if they will be there when they get out. They're not sure what will happen when they're found out and they're ready to leave. We've got, now it's getting a little colder. It's getting a little icy. We'll see what happens that way. So there's a lot of dynamic changes going on, but within a system like we have, as imperfect as Brookwood is, it's our line staff that myself and my fellow clinicians get all our information from about these kids. Our YDAs are where all the decisions about the facility should be made from, but they're not. So the work I do best is with the guys and the girls I work with. The YDAs, youth development assistants, the staff, that you know from your days, the guys that were there, they're on the floor. They know. They know the real.
Yeah, and actually, I think I talked about this in the book. I met someone in a facility who talked about how were the mothers, were the brothers, were the fathers, were the uncles and aunts to these kids, and it is actually the line staff who. You're so what you said so perfectly. I mean, it's and in some ways, what was interesting to talk to your question about reentry was that at the state level, there's quite a lot of, in some ways, arrogance about what can be done and should be done, and in some ways, a kind of real disrespect towards staff about what their expertise is around kind of like what they learn from on the ground, and also kind of a failure to understand, in the same way that kind of, I think an attendant lack of respect to kids about what they understand about realizing what they want for their own lives. So it's a lot of paternalism in many ways, but that paternalism is not only aimed at young people, but it's also at staff. And I think it was interesting because I remember talking to the state about, and suggesting, so a lot of staff when I was in the facilities, line staff were trying to help young people with their college, with their FAFSA forms, their federal financial aid forms. And they would just do this in their spare time because they were so desperate for young people to be able to have an option when they came out. I said, why not equip these staff officially with that capacity to do that? But it's not possible.
I think a lot of it goes to implementation. How do you talk about like a forum, like I'm on a regional youth justice team. I'm in the rooms, once a month with the deputy secretary of public safety and the folks trying to implement the Connecticut model, and they talk as if they speak as if they're activists. I'm an activist, right? They speak as they have the language. Good friend of mine who got me engaged left he's the person in charge of like community-based programs, the reentry stuff. He left local government to take this job, and he said it might have been like one of the worst decisions that he made, because just to send a memo, 4 people had to sign off. So when you think about implementing something as simple as a FAFSA form, like what does that look like? Like they have the language, they have the vision. Unless they're lying, I don't think they're lying in these spaces. It's just it doesn't seem to map out this.
Yeah, and actually, it's a double discretion discretion is really interesting because in many ways, like this, you all have some level of discretion in your day-to-day work, and so do the line staff. But in the areas, in some ways, arguably that matter, there's a lot less discretion. So there's discretion to, maybe not write a level or a disciplinary slip for a young person if they've messed up. But there's a lot less discretion to try to help someone out. It's a basic way of putting it.
There's one more level to this that's always there, let's put it that way. When I worked for corrections, the issue was the DAI lawsuit. When I came to OCFS, it was Department of Justice lawsuit.
Yes.
And everything is encapsulated in that, and getting out of it. And so there's that I find has always been, whether it's OPWDD, which changed its name because it was sued,
and so for context for what you're talking about, so when I first entered the system, the Department of Justice had been investigating a number of facilities for allegations of sexual abuse by staff against young girls, and then a number of other kind of sort of complaints have been made. So the Department of Justice came in, and the results of the investigation came out right when I started, and the state entered into essentially a consent decree kind of situation with the federal government. And you're right, it's interesting because the specter of that hangs over. I guess the thing that I take away from what you're saying too, that is relevant for my book, is that I guess that the obsession with compliance and with box ticking. So one other example would be that when I first entered this, the state was really interested in bringing down the restraints. It's because, justifiably so, a young person had died in custody after being restrained, and there were enormous numbers of restraints and reliance on restraints. So the state decided to try to get every facility to report the number of restraints that they were doing, I think on a weekly basis, in order to try to get them to bring those numbers down. Because the theory of change was, if we get them, if we shame them, they'll bring their numbers down. But on the ground, what you began to see were ways that actually this didn't necessarily, well, it's been good. On the positive, the restraints have seemed to, this culture of restraints has seemed to have been affected. But I think that what became complicated was that, one, the attitude didn't go away by a lot of staff members that restraints worked to control young people. So is there a culture shift? I don't think so necessarily. But also, a number of staff started foot dragging and kind of backing away because they felt that they didn't know how to de-escalate a situation without using a restraint. And actually there are quite a few injuries that happen in the process, which is not to say that restraints should have been used, but that staff needed to be able to understand effectively how to talk to young people. And I always am wary about these kinds of exercises and trying to be compliant without being considerate of those kinds of broader cultural shifts and change, because they do become an obsession by the state, and then they create, as you know, dynamics within the facility, which, so even compliance with actually the Prison Rape Reform Act I've observed in some facilities has become in many ways more a box-ticking exercise than a meaningful process of change around eliminating prison rape and kind of sexual violence in prisons, especially in adult prisons. I haven't spent as much time in juvenile facilities to observe.
I've noticed in reading literature on juvenile justice, the rhetoric of like a real criminal or the criminal-minded youth who commits a crime, and I've noticed that rhetoric also in facilities, and the teachers who say, like I've heard verbatim a teacher say about a youth, she's criminal-minded and she's hopeless, like past the point of reform. And I'm wondering first, like if you've heard that rhetoric in these facilities and what you think about that, and also if you have ideas about how to change that ideology that is so prevalent.
I have a lot to say about that. You have to read the book.
Well, so I feel like your work touches on this. I mean, I guess I'm really interested in the kind of enduring figure of the irredeemable child, and that's old. And as Frankie asked a question about the bad kid, I mean, there's always going to be a bad kid. So we can reform our way. So for example, Raise the Age focused on the good kids, the kids charged with misdemeanors. But the group of kids charged as adults, as 13 to 15-year-olds, the Willie Boskins, are the irredeemables, right? They're the kids who we don't touch because they're sort of considered to be beyond the pale. And I remember actually when I was in one of the facilities once that, staff said to me, look here, honey, like, you don't know, these are the kids charged as adults. They said something like, this is a different group than what you're used to. Those kids charged with delinquencies, they're sort of, they're treatable, they're changeable. And so the question is, why is that important to think about? Well, that's important to think about with reforms, because in reforms we've always got to be conscious about who we throw under the bus. Because when we focus on language like nonviolent offenders, I mean, I'm not saying anything that other people haven't said, but with kids it's incredibly important. Or if we talk about young people's behaviors as, I have a little bit of a pet peeve about the brain science stuff, because I think that it's really dangerous to suggest that, so we say, young people's brains are not fully developed, deviant behavior is normative, but somehow within that same stroke we say, but there are some kids who are just really so bad that they can't be changed. And I think, again, and also that draws a line between young people and adults, which suggests that only young people should be saved and adults shouldn't. So there's this idea that, even if we accept that all young people, even those who shoot guns, are okay, then adults who shoot guns aren't, right? And I represented a lot of kids who shot guns and murdered people and committed extreme acts of violence. And so I start from that place. And how do we think critically about people who commit very serious acts of violence as the people that we're really going to be taking seriously in that conversation?
That's what I said. There are a lot of people who suffer from disorders of the brain, temporal lobe epilepsy, for example, which can produce very instantly violent behavior. for no particular reason. For example,
Yeah.
and these young people are not getting the kind of, they're not being examined or,
That's what's interesting about the teen brain stuff is that, like, interestingly enough, in Rikers Island, there was a study done of young people inside the island, and some astonishingly large percentage of those young people had suffered from traumatic brain injuries.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, I think there's a danger or risk, though, that when you carve out a group of young people who are seen to be normal because they're engaging in risks, then those young people, though, who are seen to have compromised brain development, then where do they fit into the puzzle? Or, there's sort of, I think it's, it's just a really, it's a tricky puzzle, isn't it?
the question is, what do you do if they have cancer? What do you do if they have cancer?
Oh, if a young person has cancer.
I mean, just for example, as an analogy to having a brain injury or something of that sort.
Yeah.
Why would you find a way to, minimize attention paid on brain injury as opposed to,
Right.
a hangnail or something?
Right, yeah. I thought you were going to say what happens if someone has cancer in a facility, which is an interesting question too. Because actually, I did, at one of the facilities I worked with, a young person I worked with had a very serious heart condition. And he was, he couldn't engage in really active sports or other activities, or it could set his condition off. And he was sent to a facility very far from a hospital. And actually, it was a really challenging question about, for a child who's under the age of 18, but who has a very, very serious and chronic heart condition, how does the state care for that person?
I was very struck when you discussed how the young people have to walk with their hands behind their back, because I had just finished telling you I retired from New York City Public Schools, and the last few years I was in my school, which was a high-needs school. There was a charter school that was there that was known for being very strict and kind of, military camp style, and they had the students walk like that.
Yes.
And it really bothered us on the public school side because it was a lot of white teachers that were telling the students to do these things, and the students were people of color. And in fact, my principal actually said to the head of the school, "You're training them to obey a person of lighter complexion." And I saw also the trauma in these students, and they were elementary age. So it was kind of shocking. They weren't allowed to speak at all. People snapped the teachers would snap in their faces and then snap where they wanted them to go. So they were being trained. And I thought anything like that would not work with adolescents. So I was just wondering what you came to learn about obedience for obedience sake in these prisons. And you need to have some rules, but
the question is who do those rules serve? So I think the question to me became the rules about comportment serve the priorities of the facility as opposed to the process of change for the young people. And also they have deeply racialized roots and implications. So in the book I talk about some of the Freedmen's Bureau schools, which were established in the aftermath of emancipation, which were ostensibly aimed at educating formerly enslaved young people in the ways of freedom, but instead were aimed at training the next cadre of servants and domestic workers. And in some ways, the kinds of ideas about deference and kind of self-mastery and self-control, like pulling your pants up and, kind of self-possession. So like hygiene was a big obsession. Those things serve the institution, they don't serve the kid, but they have a long history, don't they? About respectability, politics, responsibility. They're all deeply, they have roots in this country that are pretty ugly.
We had always had the same problems in public school too.
Military, really.
Awesome.
So in the name of the continuities between these sort of quasi-penal institutions and places like schools. I'd like you to say more about what they actually did. So if they weren't helping them like get jobs, what did the young people do all day? What did it actually look like in a real activity?
And I just want to plug, Allison has a great book out called Addicted to Rehab, which is far better than anything I could ever write. It's a really, really fantastic book about drug treatment and about residential drug treatment programs. And she has this sort of genius approach to thinking about a kind of state-mandated treatment program, private program that I just is really good. Vouch for. It's called Addicted to Rehab. So I was really curious. So I began this project because I was really interested in mainly cognitive behavioral therapy and treatment programs that happen inside of facilities. So I actually kind of went inside because I wanted to study them. And actually, I was so struck. I've spent on and off between really 3 years doing really immersive research in the facilities. And I will say I went at night, I went during the day, I sat in classrooms, I was on units. And I think I observed 2 groups happen. Now that might have changed a little bit since I left, but that was the first thing that was quite striking, is that the kind of, in the name of this great treatment, transformation, reform, there was actually very little sort of direct intervention going on. There was this behavioral change program going on, so the kids had to obey the rules that I talked about. But that was the first surprise to me. And then I was really struck by also the limited amount of time that young people spent in school. Because actually, one thing that we fail to say is that these are actually schools. Because they're all, required to go to school, right? So these are actually, for the vast majority of the day, these are schools. But the number of alarms and interruptions and foot dragging, and I rarely saw a class finish. I was so amazed. I mean, it was incredible to see, go to a place that is actually a school and not see a complete school day. And then actually during the time that I entered, this may have changed, in the name of reform, there were actually very few sports activities going on when I was there. So Brookwood actually has incredible athletic fields, and they remained completely unused when I was there. And a lot of the facilities had very kind of they used basketball. We played a lot of basketball in the courts, but there were very few other activities. And also, despite being in actually very enriched areas like this one, very few outside groups coming in, which was really a shame. And I was just struck by the immense boredom in facility life, a lot of boredom. Now, Brookwood has a really great college program that was very enriching, but it was really only reserved for the few and is very rare. Boredom is very strong, and I think for the most part the daily routine was pretty monotonous, and school vacations were very, very difficult, very difficult.
Were the kids required to do kitchen work and work at the...
Yeah, so there are jobs. Yeah, there are jobs at the facilities. So you can work in the kitchen, and there are other jobs within the facility that young people can get access to. And those are generally reserved for young people on higher behavioral change levels. And the kitchen jobs are pretty coveted jobs, I would say. There are other jobs, I can't remember, facility clean.
There are jobs, global maintenance jobs. We've also got training programs in solar energy. We've got training in getting there. Come on, thank Drew. There are OSHA cert trainings that are equivalent to certain internship level and apprenticeship for carpentry, et cetera, in the city. And there is an increasing number of outreach going on.
Okay.
But again, a lot of that is outside once the kids leave us.
So
it's hard to judge.
Yeah, and depending on the facility, so like, for example, at one facility there was a Midas auto shop. That closed down actually.
That was Brookwood. There used to be that there.
Increasingly less funding for that kind of.
I think it's less. It was before my time. Less funding, and I think also safety and security issues.
Safety and security issues. So
funding and the cross connection with outside agencies and legality.
Yes. So I think one thing we can't underestimate is also the power of something like Attica, which was in 1971, which really impacted a lot on outside groups being able to come in and do the work. And that was one impact. Safety and security. So that was in the name of safety and security. When I was in the facilities, they argued that actually young people going outside or throwing a ball at each other was too dangerous, or there's a lot of restrictions on movement.
I think generally a lot of that is because you'll have one severe incident.
Yes.
And where someone takes a baseball bat and seriously injures another inmate or what have you. And so that one.
That sets off the huge, yeah.
It's hard for me to sit here, a black man, one of two who are here, which I think is disgraceful, by the way. But you're talking about some things that were designed and remain designed to break the will of the subject.
Yeah.
Okay?
It's disgraceful, isn't it? Yeah.
We can call it many things. We can call it management as opposed to treatment. But the bottom line is it's a military model that is intended to break the will of the inmates.
I was struck when you said military earlier, because in many ways when we talk about, like, so people will say the boot camp, there was a boot camp in New York State, and that was closed. But the thing you said that was striking is that, so we say, oh, well, that's gone, we don't do that anymore. But you're right, it's a model which requires it's hierarchical too. It's deeply hierarchical, because even as I saw the token economy, this idea that you kind of ascend through a system if you act deferential and say, behave in a particular way. You're right. It's about eroding of self. So one thing that I always think about is, like, young people are really funny, and they're like silly and they're crazy and they're annoying and they're all of these things that we know as parents and other people. But it's incredibly upsetting to be in a place where, humor or joking is viewed as a disciplinary matter.
What about solitary confinement?
Yeah, so in OCFS, again, this may change, but so in OCFS they use room confinement. It's called room confinement. And at the time I was in the facilities, they would use the infirmary for room confinement. And again, solitary confinement is so interesting because there are all these euphemisms, right? So and I think in New York State, there was a really great article in the New York Times a couple weeks ago about how solitary confinement has been reformed in New York State for people under the age of 22, but New York City is actually transferring teenagers from Rikers Island to upstate jails, to Albany jail for the purposes of solitary confinement. So there have been big efforts at reform, right? But there are various ways that solitary confinement can operate. So in the units at the facilities, the doors can be locked or are locked from the outside in, and young people go on room time for long periods of time. I think we could say we could end the practice of doing solitary confinement for 5 days, but what does it look like for 1 day? Or it's used as a measure of behavioral control, but what does that do, even if it's for 2 hours? Because it may, when I was there, it was used maybe for 2 or 3 hours, but is that acceptable? I don't know.
It's a mental health model. It's called seclusion.
Seclusion, yes, right. Yeah.
Sitting in the corner.
And I think as someone from the mental health world, I think that's actually something that we need to be a little, like, it's something I think about that we have to be careful about, because in the juvenile justice system, there's a lot of talk about how a lot of young people suffer from mental health difficulties who are in the system, and that's very true. But I think we have to be vigilant, because if we say, okay, then we should make all juvenile facilities look like mental hospitals or psychiatric hospitals, but we're still confining young people against their, we're taking away their freedom. We have to be so careful to understand what punishment looks like always. And so I have a good friend who works in the mental health system in New York City in the treatment courts, and she always reminds me, juvenile justice advocates argue for young people to go to psychiatric hospitals, but they're not so great either. That we have to continue to think about all of these institutions.
Yeah.